Today we are going to replace the screen on an iPhone 5C. First thing we're going to do here is go ahead and turn the phone off. As you can see, this LCD is still good, but the screen is cracked. So go ahead and power down the phone. And you'll notice here in just a second that I removed the SIM card tray. You do not need to take the SIM card tray out for this repair. Just kind of an old habit. Usually do that before we get started. In any case, make sure that the phone is powered down if at all possible. At the bottom here, we're going to have two pentalobe screws right next to the lightning port connector. We'll go ahead and remove those two. And this is the only place that you'll be using this driver is for the pentalobe screws here. Everything from here on out will be a standard Phillips screwdriver. Usually a 00 or 000 will do the trick. And we're going to take a thin pry tool and very carefully go inside the plastic right underneath the glass, just enough to get this started. Now once it starts to pop up, I recommend that you switch over to something a little softer, a guitar pick, plastic, anything that you can fit in here. This is part of a lens protector kit. They send these little plastic pieces along with them. So again, a thin guitar pick like the nylon flexible type will work just fine. What we're going to do is just kind of run up and down the sides here, just about almost to the top, so that it kind of pops out of the frame. Now you want to be careful here because on the inside we have cables that are connected to the top of the LCD, and if the LCD can be damaged, we don't want can be salvaged, we don't want to damage it in the process. So you're going to very carefully just kind of lift this up, and you pull it down towards the home button a little bit, just to make sure that the top edge of the screen will clear the inside of the frame. And here you can see that we have a panel that covers up the battery terminal here. So we're going to go ahead and take these two screws out first so that we can remove this metal piece and then disconnect the battery. That's always the first thing that you want to do once you get inside the phone. Sooner the better. That way we don't have any electricity flowing through this as we're working on it. And this battery terminal itself will actually lift straight up towards the ceiling, so be very careful when you pry these away. You don't want to put any sideways pressure on them, just kind of lift it straight up towards you. And you'll see we have 4 screws that are holding the retaining panel up here at the top. And this one in the top left-hand corner is going to be a bit longer, and it's also typically not magnetic or attracted to any magnetic devices. So even if you've magnetized your driver, you will probably have to pull this out with a small pair of tweezers. So do be careful with that one. It tends to fall off sometimes and get stuck inside the phone. Once we get those off, we'll go ahead and take out these remaining 3, and the panel will literally just kind of lift off. It doesn't really have any retaining clips like the 5 and the 5S do. So slightly different design here. And of course, those are not going to be interchangeable. So we want to make sure that we don't mix up the screws, and definitely don't try to put them into a different phone. That's not what they're made for. We're just going underneath the edge here, and you can lift that whole piece off. And then underneath, we're going to have our 3 flex cables that we need to disconnect. I start with the top one here, as these first 2 kind of cover up the third one, so it's a little bit tricky to see it. And they run kind of different directions. Once you get the second one disconnected here, you might want to go underneath with something like this. This plastic stick spudger works out really well for getting into these small areas, because this last one is kind of embedded and surrounded by material. It makes it a little tough to get to. So you can see I took a few different angles to get in there. Once we get the screen out, we do need to transfer the hardware from the old assembly over to the replacement screen. These typically will not come with all the parts installed. If they do, good for you, you're lucky, but most of the time we're going to have to move over our home button, speaker, front-facing camera, and so forth. So we've got a few different screws that we need to remove. Down here you'll have 2 that are holding the plate in for the home button retaining panel. So we want to go ahead and take those out. And I like to move things over as soon as possible. That kind of minimizes the possibility of mixing things up or putting something together incorrectly. So you will notice there's a bit of flex cable here that we're going to have to heat up and kind of pull away from the assembly where those 2 little contacts are. So you're going to need something thin, not sharp. You'll see I'm using the pry tool here again. If you need to, you can use something like a thin blade, but you want to make sure it's not too sharp because you don't want to cut into these. You just want to get underneath them and release the adhesive from the glass. And then we're going to have to set this aside just for a minute while we do the same with the home button. And this has got an adhesive ring that goes all the way around the outside of it. I recommend you try to salvage that if possible, because it makes it a lot easier. Just take your small finger and very gently push from the bottom. You don't want to tear this gasket. This is what seals moisture and dust out of your phone. So if you can get this whole thing off at once, that's great. If not, you might have to add some adhesive to it. The tricky part is getting this thing to line up straight. You don't want your square in the middle of your button to be sideways, because that's the first thing you're going to notice. So you might have to manipulate this a little bit. It took me a few tries to get this straight, and you'll see here that I'm going to peel back the plastic a little bit. It makes it easier to work with. So just kind of move that around again very carefully. Just pull it off and stick it back on until you get it positioned properly. Once you're satisfied with the way that it's sitting, we can go ahead and put this panel back on to hold it in place. All right, and the next thing we're going to do is take this screw out from the bottom. This panel is held in by about 7 screws total. You've got this one oddball down here at the bottom. You have 1, 2, 3, 4 along the sides, kind of in different positions, but these 4 screws are all actually the same size. So we'll go ahead and take those out, and then you're going to have a shared screw up the top where the speaker assembly is, in addition to a kind of an awkward one. This is unique to the 5C. There's a screw that kind of goes in from the top here, you'll see shortly. So go ahead and take these out. Again, don't mix them up with anything else, but those 4 are actually interchangeable. And you see we've got 2 screws up here at the top, and we're going to move this entire panel over with the front and rear facing cameras and the proximity sensor attached to them. Oh, and when you get to this clip here, you'll have to kind of unhook this thing at the top in order to remove it. And once you do that, that will release the retaining panel and the earpiece speaker. And you can see we've got a couple hooks here, and that's what holds it in place at the top. And you can see the interface there for where the speaker actually touches onto the flex cable up there at the top. We've got one more screw that needs to come out. And this one's broken up pretty well there, so go ahead and take that piece all out at once. And then we've got a couple plastic pieces that we need to salvage from inside the phone. One is for the front-facing camera. This is a dust cover. It's kind of just stuck in there because you saw the top of the phone was destroyed pretty well. And then we have another one for the proximity sensor here. You want to take out this little plastic piece. My camera has a tough time focusing on these kind of things for some reason, but there's a little square inside here, and if you have to, you might want to heat this up. Otherwise, you can usually kind of get under it. Try to keep it in one piece if possible, and make sure that we remove any broken glass that might be attached to that. And these two are going to transfer over to the new piece. And you'll see this has a very small area here at the top, which if you want to, you might want to add a little bit of adhesive. I find that helps out. I've cut a little piece here of 300 SL, I believe it is. I'll put the link in the video description in case you need to get some of this. And it comes in really handy. It's cheap, it works well, it's very strong. And this will help keep our plastic piece lined up straight, which is going to make sure that our proximity sensor is positioned properly in the front-facing window. If that gets out of whack, what's going to happen is your screen's not going to shut off. And you'll find here that it's easiest to pick this up from the thinnest side, kind of down on the bottom. And very carefully set that in place. Make sure you're not putting any pressure on the back of the LCD at this point. There's nothing really protecting it right now. So I know you can tell that I put my fingers on it once in a while, but I'm not pushing down on this whatsoever. Next thing we want to do is get a little bit more adhesive, and we'll put this inside for the dust cover for the front-facing camera. Not a big deal, but it will keep your front-facing camera nice and clean if you're working in dusty areas or you live in an environment like that where dust tends to get inside of the phone. Can be tough getting this wax paper off sometimes. And now we can just go ahead and move the entire panel over. Make sure that you get inside of these brackets. If it feels like it's not slipping into place, you might have to pull them apart just a little bit. And then of course we want to make sure that we get our front-facing camera and everything else sat down here correctly. If you want to, you can add adhesive under this cable. I don't think it's going to be a big deal really, because once you put the earpiece back into place and put the screws inside, everything should lock into place. So you shouldn't have to worry about it too much. But if it's moving around a bit and bothering you, you can always go ahead and put some adhesive underneath where those two terminals are. And I'm going to go ahead and put this oddball screw back in the top here before I do anything else. So I've got those two screws into the rear panel of the LCD. This will kind of hold everything in place while we're working with the top cable here. And this one can be a little bit tricky, so if it feels like it's not sitting down flush, you might have to move it around, kind of pull it out, start back over again. But everything should sit in here real evenly when you get it positioned properly. And remember, we've got those hooks at the top we have to kind of get in place in order to lock this down. And from there, we've got the two screws that are going to go inside. Again, the very top screw is much longer than the others, so make sure you put this into the right place. If you go too far through one of these, screw it down too tight, you can damage the LCD. So you want to be absolutely certain you do not mix these screws up. Now the bottom one you can tighten down until it sits, winds all the way in. At the top one, I wouldn't tighten it down too much. It doesn't take a whole lot of torque, but you do want to make sure that your front-facing camera, you can see I flipped it over there just a minute ago. You want to make sure that the front-facing camera is centered. Otherwise, you might have to shift it around a little bit. And then, of course, we have our 4 screws to go back in on the outsides. And from here, we have one last thing we want to transfer, and that's going to be the padding from the back of the pop connectors. You want to make sure that you take this stuff off and move it over to the new part. If it becomes damaged or you're not able to get it off of here, you can always cut out something like a piece of electrician's tape at roughly the same size. But I do try to preserve these pads from the original screen whenever possible. And you see, if you hit it with the heat gun and kind of just get under there very carefully, and again, I'm not using a sharpened razor blade. This is very dulled, so difficult to cause any damage to yourself or the phone, but you just want to very carefully kind of slide it underneath the corner there until you can grab enough of it to peel it off, and then it should transfer right across without too much trouble. Again, sometimes these things just fall apart, so if that's the case, just find something else to substitute. But you do want to make sure you put these inside. They'll prevent the metal piece on the back of the pop connector from shorting out against anything, and it will also help to keep it plugged in, because that little extra padding helps sit underneath that retaining panel that once you put the screws in, it will make it much less likely that the connectors detach if the phone experiences some sort of impact shock. You drop it. These things do happen. So these pads are here for a reason. If you open up the phone and they're missing, then you can assume the person who repaired it last time was not aware of that. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky. You want to just feel around in here. You do not want to push very hard on these. Do not force them in. If they're not lined up properly and you push down too hard, you will damage the connector. So if you damage the connector on the board, that's usually going to be a wrap. So be very careful when you plug these in. And again, you just might have to fool around with them a little bit, and it does help to have something there to kind of rest the LCD against, unless you have an extra pair of hands with you, so that way, once we get everything plugged in, we can kind of just rest the weight of the display up against this other object, and then go ahead and put the panel on. And the rest from here is pretty much downhill. And be sure that you tuck the 3 tabs at the top of the display assembly into the outer housing before you push it all inside at the bottom.